Hello, today is September 3rd, 2009. We're meeting today with Mr. James Bedingfield at his home in Greeley, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Jim, and I appreciate you sitting down today to tell your story.
It's going to be fun. I haven't done this in one piece for a long time.
Very good. Well, let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
I was born, of course, this is hearsay, but I was born on October 10th, 1924, in the town of Bandon on the southern Oregon coast. My parents had both been school teachers, and my father later had gone to law school, and a couple of years after I was born, I had a sister, Nancy, and after about 3 more years, we moved from Bandon to a place called Marshfield, which later, during the Second World War, changed its name to Coos Bay. It was a huge lumber, wood fiber shipping port, the largest in the world at that time. And I spent the rest of my years through high school in Coos Bay and went through the public school system, played a little college football, and everything else is about like everybody else is. And in my senior year, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
Do you remember where you were and what you were thinking when you heard that?
Well, I was in the backyard helping my dad clean up the old stuff from the previous growing season and just taking care of the grass and one thing and another. And I remember my mother came out the back door and told us she'd just heard it on the radio. And of course, I don't think my father or I had any idea of the magnitude of what that meant at the time, but I know that we were both pretty well ticked off about it. And I continued my year at school, and I got a job at the Forest Service, which I'd had for several years, a fire lookout and fire suppression crews. And then when I started the University of Oregon in the fall, and I joined the Marines. They came through looking for officer candidates right after I got to Oregon, and I joined up, and it wasn't until the next July that they actually called us to do anything. And
Now, how did you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how did you come to choose, of all the branches of service, why did you choose the Marines?
Well, I had always had a lot of admiration for them. I liked the way they operated, and it was sure a good choice. It was the greatest bunch of people I've ever been with.
So you had made it through your freshman year of college, and then
Yes.
that summer is when you were called up.
Yes.
Okay.
And they sent me to USC, and they were going to just leave me in a liberal arts course for 2 years or more. And I kind of lost interest in that part of it at that point, and I started taking out a girl, and things kind of went to seed on the studies. and at the end of that first term, why, they and I agreed mutually that I would go to boot camp, which I think was another very wise move. And I'll tell you why if I can remember it later on.
Yeah.
But I went to San Diego to boot camp, and as soon as I got through with that, I was sent to Sea School, which was also at the recruit depot in San Diego, where they trained men to serve aboard the major ships of the Navy. And I got through with that, and then I was assigned for about a month or 6 weeks to be a kind of a flunky in the headquarters of the recruit depot. And then they shipped me up to San Francisco, and I got in with the next platoon that came through Sea School, graduated. And I swear, the railroad cars they hauled us up there on were used in the Civil War. I couldn't believe that they would be around any longer, but it didn't make any difference because we sat up all night anyway. But we were put aboard a transport on one of the piers right under the San Francisco end of the Bay Bridge. There were about 80 of us.
Did you say you were put into a platoon or a unit at this point, or were you still kind of
Oh, it was just a platoon for the purposes of getting us overseas.
Oh, okay, okay,
It happened to be a platoon out of the sea school that graduated after mine.
okay.
And I was just thrown in with them to
Gotcha.
get me over there. And we were on board one night, and we were told that there was going to be a group of troops of some kind come aboard, Navy people, that we were going to keep an eye on, quite a bunch, about 1,500, I guess, all the way to Pearl Harbor. And the next morning was Sunday, and about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we got the call to get all of our combat gear on and fall out on the pier. So we did, and here was a bunch of trucks showed up, and we got aboard them, and they took us over the Bay Bridge to the island, turned left and went down to Treasure Island, and there was a full-blown riot going on in the mess hall down there. Evidently the cooks ran out of fried chicken on the dinner line for Christmas, and they fed some of these people fried bologna, and they didn't like it. And I guess one thing led to another, but it was pretty exciting for about a half an hour. And we got the lid put on that, and we went back to the ship. And the next day, lo and behold, here came the rioters and put aboard the ship, and that we were to guard all the way to the middle of the Pacific. And we did that, and I know that as we were leaving the pier, they fed us, and they gave us reconstituted mashed potatoes and a great big pork chop that wasn't totally cooked. It must have been an inch thick, and pork gravy. And of course, it didn't take very long to get down to the Golden Gate Bridge, and we went out under it. And by the time we got out to these rocks off of the coast, I can't remember the name of them right now, but I was so sick I couldn't see anything. And my job on that trip was to guard the safe in the bridge area, which contained a payroll for Pearl Harbor.
Oh, jeez.
And they could have stolen that whole superstructure, and I wouldn't have cared. But about the fourth day, my stomach began to settle down, and we pulled into Pearl Harbor, and there was the usual bunch of 6x6 trucks there waiting for us, and we got in, and they hauled us up to the Marine barracks in the Navy Yard.
Sorry to interrupt here, but had Pearl Harbor by and large been repaired, and was there still damage from, I mean, this was a couple years later.
Well, there
but,
was still some wreckage around.
Was there? Okay, yeah.
But all the sunken ships were gone.
Okay, yeah.
And at least as far as I saw. And I served in the yard guard. I guarded the docks, dry docks at Pearl Harbor, and we guarded the tank farm that the Japanese did not bomb, which very fortunately. And in the meantime, the Navy had hollowed out one of the mountains east of Pearl Harbor, huge thing, into separate chambers, evidently, and had sealed it with something, and they had run pipelines down to the harbor, and that's where they stored the oil for the fleet. And they had a little railroad that ran around inside of that mountain, and of course there were tunnels going into it, and I can remember spending a lot of nights at the mouth of one of those tunnels with this steel prison-like gate locked with me inside.
Wow.
And I can remember going to sleep, standing up and falling up against that gate. And it was there was absolute dark and nothing to see or do. And of course it was Hawaii, and it was pretty warm. But after that, we just continued our guard duties, and then we got a call one day to go up to the Seabees that worked in the yard up into their barracks area outside of the yard up at Aiea near the Navy Hospital. And we went screaming out of there like there was, the end of the world was coming, and we got up there and there was a riot. And guess who was involved? This bunch from Treasure Island was on one side. They were black troops, and the whites were across the street. And this Marine colonel who was in charge of the operation was not a man to fool with. And we were strung out up and down this street that separated them. And we had machine guns and the whole works.
Hmm.
And he had a PA system on his Jeep. And he said, if any man he said, these are the orders to the Marines. If any man steps off of the curbing on either side of the street, shoot him. Well, that calmed things down pretty well for a while. And then after a while, it got hotter and the people's tempers were getting shorter. And finally, there was three of them that stepped off the curb and they got shot. And I was immediately picked up and in a Jeep, and I was hauled to the USS Vincennes down in the harbor. Didn't go back to the barracks. Still had a weapon from the barracks armory. And I went aboard the ship, and I never did get my sea bag back. So they had to give me all new stuff. And the next day or two, the ship left for the Western Pacific.
Huh. Wow.
And I heard from one of the fellows who was in the riot at a later time back in the States after I returned that I met him back in Virginia on a job I had there. And he said that they finally broke up the riot by using what is called C2 gas, Adamsite gas, which causes people to lose control of their nervous system, and the results are really awful. And he said it was the messiest thing he'd ever seen in his life, but he said the riot was over within 2 minutes. And while at sea, we...
Well, let me back up. Why did they pull you off the line? Were you the only one, or did they pull a bunch of people?
They
or what?
got a couple of them, 3 or 4 of them.
Any idea why you were chosen to be pulled off? And
We were the shooters.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay,
And they wanted us out of there.
got it. Fair enough. Yeah.
And we went first to the Marshall Islands. The Mid-Pacific campaigns had just ended. So the Marshall Islands were all shot up, Enewetak, Kwajalein, and all those. And we went to another atoll on the southeast corner of that island group. I never thought I'd forget any of it, but I can't remember now. And we were there for a while, did a lot of target practice. This was a brand new ship. Everybody in the Marine detachment was from the East Coast except one other fellow. I don't know how he got in there. But and then we headed out towards Saipan, and we got the word that we were going to go to Iwo Jima area. So we went up there, and this was all done by aircraft. On the way up, there was a ship of some kind, like a little fishing boat. About was it the day before we got to Iwo, I guess. And they turned 40 millimeters on it and blew it to Kingdom Come, and we just kept right on going like we'd swatted a fly. And we were off the coast up there, and the aircraft bombed Chichijima and Iwojima, which are close together. And then we turned around and headed south, and from then on it tends to get a little blurry, so I'm just going to tell you the high points.
Sure.
We bombarded Peleliu just before the landing. We used a lot of ammunition. Our cruiser was a 6-inch. It had 12 6-inch guns in 4 turrets, and 12 5-inch guns in 6 turrets, and 40 millimeter guns and 20 millimeter guns.
Wow.
And I was the gunner on one of the 20 millimeter guns. And there was a great long white barracks, awfully long, maybe a block long, and the word came from some source that we were to blow up the barracks. So the 6-inch guns started firing, and they started at one end of the barracks, and they sliced it just like a bologna. And the Japanese were pouring out the other end. And by the time we got through, I'm sure not all of them got out, but there was nothing left of the wreckage. And there was a lighthouse there that they felt that that we were using to the gunners were using it to whatever they did to hit the target. And there was some Japanese in it, they felt, that were spying on the ships or doing something they didn't like, so they shot one shot at it. We were out a mile, a 5-inch round, and it was exploded right in the top of the lighthouse. It was a fabulous shot.
Wow.
And we left. That was a very difficult campaign for the Marine Corps. They lost a lot of men. And after that, we were involved in a lot of sea-air battles. It was going on all the time. And we, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea that was the end of the Japanese Navy, and we were in the middle of that. We were up there. We sent aircraft from the eastern side of the Philippines. It was on over to Manila, and I remember that they hooked all of the headphones of the gunners up to the radio equipment on the ship so we could listen to the pilots.
Wow.
And they had also the commercial radio station in Manila on it, and they left the Manila radio station on, and they were talking and playing music, and all of a sudden you could hear this bombing, and these radio announcers were yelling at each other, and things really came apart. And then they switched it over to the American pilots and their chatter. So we got a good earful of that.
Wow. Can you describe the site as you were seeing it? I mean, for
We
someone that...
all we could see was the east side of the islands. They'd gone clear across
Oh,
the
okay.
islands.
Gotcha. Okay.
But that was the same time, I can't remember if it was before or after, but we were one of the 4 task groups in the task force. And it included at least probably 2 carriers by then, and maybe a battleship, and heavy and light cruisers, and we probably had 20 destroyers. It was a big fleet all by itself.
Wow.
And we went in along the east side of the island, and this was purely for morale purposes for the Filipinos, I'm sure. But we went in there at about 27 knots, which is pretty fast for a fleet that big. There was a great big bay there, several miles around it, and we came around there and just made a great big sweep, and all the battle flags were flying. And I'm sure it was quite a sight because there were thousands of them on the beach.
Wow.
And we just kept on going whatever else we were supposed to do. We were involved in the, well, this was the first landing we were involved in, was at Saipan. And it was another tough landing. And we were out there protecting the aircraft carriers again. We anchored at Saipan at the name of the town there on the west side of the island. And I remember the old Wyoming, which is an old battleship, wasn't at Pearl Harbor, but they were anchored about a quarter of a mile away from us, and those old 14-inch guns, and man, they were just blasting everything in sight, and it was a spectacular sight. And
So your primary responsibility was to protect the fleet. You weren't softening the beach at all for
no, not that time.
Okay.
Although I'm sure they maybe they had us there just in case.
Yeah,
We were not in on all of the hot scoop.
Yeah.
Although we sure like to peddle a lot of rumors on purpose just to see what that came up.
Yeah.
But anyway, then we went up around the north side of the island, and that's where we saw all these Japanese civilian bodies in the water.
Oh, geez.
Hundreds of them. Little tiny babies and all. It was just awful.
Those
But
being the people that had committed suicide, jumped the cliffs.
They
and committed
jumped off the cliffs
Yeah.
on the north end. And we went on then down south, and well, also then a little bit later we went way down in the South China Sea, way down, clear to the island of Hunan, I believe. And we shot up the whole China coast from one end to the other. The planes were coming and going just like streetcars all day and all night, as late as they could. And after that, we were involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when the Army was being landed on Luzon and or Leyte, I mean. And the Japanese sent three separate groups of what was left of the Japanese Navy from Borneo. Brunei was the port. And, well, suffice it to say that one group came through the group of islands one way and another one came through another. And the whole Fifth Fleet was out on the east side of the whole Philippine chain, right off of the island, the beach where these guys were going ashore. And we gave a lot of air support to them. And this was about the same time that this story about the radio station in Manila came about. And there was this one of the three groups of Navy ships was one that was up northwest. It was out about 300 miles. And it was a decoy. We didn't know it. But it had carriers and converted battleships and one thing or another in it. By this time, the Japanese were very short of oil. And this idea of this was it was going to draw the Fifth Fleet away from the islands where the landing was up to fight this thing, and they didn't even have any aircraft on their aircraft carriers. And so Bull Halsey heard about it, and he took his part of the fleet, which I was a part of, and we took off north as fast as we could go to get there, because it was a chance for we had two battleships with us, the Wisconsin and the Iowa, I believe it was, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I get that mixed up. But anyway, there were two battleships, two carriers, maybe three, a special job, and cruisers and destroyers. Big group. And we were just going for all we could make with those diesel engines. And we were sent large flights of aircraft out there. And all of a sudden, the people back up in the Philippines, they started asking, where is Halsey? Where's Halsey? Well, this was going out over the radio in code, and it was picked up in Hawaii, and that's when the Admiral Nimitz, the chief Navy officer in the Pacific, he sent a message out, where is Admiral Halsey? And the guy, you've probably read this story, they always put a lot of garbage in with these messages just to confuse anybody that tries to interpret. And he added to it, the whole world wonders, with no animosity or anything. It was just Halsey got it. And I guess he just blew up totally. Took him an hour to regain his composure. In the meantime, the fleet down at the Philippines, or the part that had been left behind, called up and said, "You'd better get back here right now. We need heavy ships." Well, what had happened was this little tiny outfit on the west side called Taffy III, which was these little jeep carriers and maybe a couple of destroyers. There were maybe 20 of those little tiny carriers, but they only had a handful of planes, and they weren't designed to actively support an invasion. They were there to carry water and make observations and anything but bombing the Japanese. Well, these guys were out there fighting this enormous Japanese fleet. They didn't have a ship among them that was 1/10 the size of the Japanese ships. And by golly, they scared them off. They turned around and left. The Japanese did, because the admiral in charge thought that he was up against the whole American Navy, which was just a little rump. It was more of a supply and maintenance type operation. And there's one story that went around about these little destroyers and destroyer escorts mostly, which are smaller, were all shooting at these Japanese aircraft, these ships mostly, with everything they had. They were trying to torpedo them, and the destroyers were being destroyed. And there was one instance where this sailor was on a 20 millimeter machine gun, and he was shooting for all his worth, and these Japanese fleet all of a sudden just made a big sweep and turned and head the other way. And this kid was yelled at his captain, which was right next to him, and he says, "Captain, they're getting away." But anyway, we got back after the whole show was over. The Japanese were just thoroughly trashed. Their fleet was no longer effective.
Huh.
The old battleships were all lined up and across the T, as the Navy says, where the Navy's battleships were out at right angles to the approaching lineup of Japanese ships, which allowed the United States Navy to use every single one of its major guns, while these poor Japanese ships could only fire straight ahead.
Gotcha.
And they were blown to bits. And the other ships were too. One of the largest Japanese ships, two largest battleships in the world, and was sunk, and it just went on and on. And we got back at 1 o'clock in the morning at the Philippines, and picked up a Japanese cruiser. It was evidently picking up men that had been blown into the ocean in the big battle. And we still had the 2 battleships and about 8 cruisers and I don't know how many destroyers. The big carriers had been left up north to finish off that Japanese fleet. And we cut loose, not the battleships, just the cruisers. And on the time of flight buzzer, there must have been 30 shells, 8-inch and 6-inch, hit that Japanese cruiser all at once.
Jeez.
And it just kept up. And I don't know how many rounds hit it, but there were hundreds fired at it. And it just erupted, blue sky high.
Mm.
And so there was nothing more for us to do, so we just went about like we always had before. During that time, we went up to Formosa short after that and got into a big air battle up there. And after that, we got into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as it was called, where the Japanese, their big plan always was to lure the American fleet out to where they could get at it with their battleships. Well, they were trying this again. They had thought they had enough land-based aircraft in that area to attack us, and they sent the carriers out. By this time, the Japanese Navy had no experienced pilots. They were just completely inadequate for the American, to fight the American pilots. And it was pretty serious. The chaplain aboard our ship spoke to the crew beforehand, and I've got a copy of his remarks someplace in my papers around. And he told us, look, this is going to be a desperate fight, and you should make your peace with God, was the general run of it. And we didn't get below decks for 4 days, and but we sure got an eyeful. And a lot of it happened beyond our sight because the aircraft were shooting down the Japanese. That was the day of the Great Marianas Turkey shoot.
Okay.
300 and some aircraft. And let's see.
Let me interrupt you here. After the chaplain made those kind of remarks, what goes through your mind as you prepare for that? Or what were you thinking? Do you remember what you were thinking? And how does a person prepare for something like that?
The first thing I thought of was that about 12 feet below me, there was about 60 tons of TNT in our ammunition. You never forgot that. There were just, thousands and thousands of rounds of that 6-inch and 5-inch, 40 and 20 millimeter stuff in magazines right below us. The Marine compartment there was this much metal between us and that. Well, let's just be in the Navy and working with the Navy. Anyway, this one thing happened They sent the Navy Air out to get the fleet, the Japanese fleet, which was coming in. They were going to polish us off after all these Japanese aircraft that were shot down had pretty well been, they had shot down all the Americans and damaged the ships. Well, they were way off, way out west of us. And from what I've read since then, the admiral in charge of the fleet, I don't remember whether it was Misher or Halsey at that time, but he sent the Navy Air out after them, even though there was some doubt if they had enough fuel to get back. He wanted to get rid of those ships. And they flew out there and they did their job. I don't remember what the result of it was, but it was a total success. And they got back, and it was pitch black. I mean, it may have been around midnight for all I can remember. Well, I suppose it was as soon as it got really dark. And they were flashing down all around the fleet. They ran out of gas, and they were coming in two at a time. They were landing on carriers other than their own, anything to get that plane down before it ran out of gas. And it got so bad with these people swirling around in the dark that he turned on the searchlights of the cruisers. Huge lights shining up.
Which normally goes against policy. You always have blackout, right?
That's a
with
court
the
martial
submarines.
offense to show a light.
Yeah.
And of course, then they knew where the carriers were, and they headed straight for them. And it saved a lot of the planes and pilots. Although the pilot loss wasn't great, they rescued them even though they were down. There was nothing to worry about at that point. The Japanese couldn't hit us. And let's see, that was the Battle of the Philippine Sea.
Well, you had talked about there was that 4-day period where you didn't even go below deck. How does a person function like that? Obviously, you weren't sleeping properly. You probably weren't eating properly. All with the umbrella of war around you. How do you think you functioned during that time period?
You just did.
Huh.
They'd bring sandwiches to you. They'd get permission to go down to go to the toilet. At times we were told to go over the side. You just sit there and wait for something to happen.
Wow.
For some reason, I don't remember any kamikazes even present in that battle. They showed up first around the Philippines and Formosa. But after that, this is probably out of sequence.
That's fine.
Then we went to Iwo Jima, and we never participated in the actual landing. But we were in the area, mostly between there and Japan. It was only 600 miles, so they could use land-based aircraft to attack the island, and they did. And they attacked the carrier out there and banged it up. And I don't remember all the details, but there was some resistance that made it necessary to constantly be on watch. Mm-hmm. So we were there to intercept any aircraft that came down. And I think we did a pretty good job of it. And toward the end of that was about a month that campaign lasted, or a little more. And we were in that area for a lot of that time.
Now, would you guys being on the ship, would you get word on how things were going on the island and stuff? And,
oh yeah, but
okay.
we were told very little.
Okay.
But, which I understand, because when I was called back to Korea, I understood it even more, because the stuff that I knew was certainly nothing that we wanted everybody to know.
Okay.
And what I knew was a lot less than the guys above me, so that's just the way they do
okay,
it.
Yeah.
It was a court-martial offense to have a camera
right.
or keep a diary.
Right.
And anyway, when we were out there on that deck, sometimes even when it was not such a long period of time, we'd just sleep on the deck. But we were soaking wet a lot of the time, because even in halfway decent weather, to launch those aircraft, they had to turn into the wind. Well, when you turned into the wind, the waves came over the side of the ship and halfway fill up our gun tub momentarily.
Wow.
But you just couldn't avoid it. those sailors down in the hull knew that when they started hearing the 20 millimeters start to fire, that meant that things were getting pretty close. And boy, so we'd have brass piled up in the bottom of that tub sometimes, 6 inches deep.
Wow.
But anyway, we try to think of the next thing. Probably is out of turn. Well, I'll go to Okinawa. We went down to Okinawa and we went up to Formosa first. I think that's when that happened, and we got in that big battle. And the Japanese radio had telling the world that they had shot down sunk all the American ships.
Is this Tokyo Rose?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that there was a magnificent victory. Well, they didn't do anything. They just lost several hundred aircraft. And they understood that Halsey sent a telegram or a message to the headquarters in Pearl Harbor that he advised them that the American fleet had been raised from the bottom, repaired, and is proceeding against the Japanese in some other direction. There were a lot of funny things like that happened. And then, of course, the last big one was Okinawa. And I was not there at the time of the landing. At that time, I got a Marine Corps enlisted appointment to the Naval Academy.
Mm.
And so I got off of the Vincennes onto an oiler and went back to Ulithi, which was a huge fleet center in the Caroline Islands, east of the Philippines. And I got aboard a ship there, a transport that they were using like a hotel for people coming and going. And they put me aboard a wrecked destroyer that had been hit by a kamikaze. And we went along with the Intrepid, a carrier that was wrecked, and another destroyer that was wrecked.
Mm.
And we plugged along across the Pacific for weeks. Oh, well, I forgot to tell you one thing. One day when we were off of the Japanese coast, the Japanese air people really came after us. We were within 30 miles of the coast of Kyushu. And they hit the Franklin, a new Essex-class carrier, a couple of times, and the thing was just burning like kerosene. And the smoke was pouring out of it, and we all figured it was a goner. And I'll always remember that the whole fleet speeded up to every knot they could get out of it, and then on the Franklin, they turned that thing hard to starboard and tilt the ship, and all this bombs and rockets and unexploded, and foam and gasoline came pouring out these great big holes in the side of the ship on the hangar deck. Just 3 or 4 of those big holes. I mean, they were probably 30, I don't know how long, 30 feet long and 10 feet high. And then they'd straighten up and we'd do it again. And it was just amazing that somebody thought of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And they got the fires out, and the thing was just a black hulk. But it was running. And we stayed with it for several days, and all during that time they were burying their dead, and it was over 700.
Mm.
All day long. And then when I got back to Pearl Harbor just after that. See, how was it? I left. Iwo Jima was over with. Well, at any rate, when I got back to Pearl Harbor, the Franklin was tied up there. They hadn't taken it on. They eventually took it clear around to New York and used it for bond sales and one thing and another. But I heard that when they towed, they had a lot of Navy waves who had a chorus of women. And boy, they were on the dock, waiting to greet what was left. And they started to sing, and they broke down.
Wow.
And I lost a lot of friends out there.
Friends that you'd grown up with, or friends you had met in the service, or both, or
In the service.
Yeah.
I only ever saw two guys from my hometown, or from home. One of them came aboard our ship when it was anchored at Ulithi, and the other one, he passed across one of the dry docks that I was guarding in Pearl Harbor.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, well, we had a good chat.
Huh.
But anyway, I left and I went to Virginia to the school. Took me almost 3 months to get there.
Were you able to get a furlough to go home?
Well, I got there, and when I got there, they said, well, you're 6 months late. So I took the examination the next morning. They'd had a school, see. They had for all these people that had these appointments. And so they got me up the next morning, and I took the exam, raw, with no preparation of any kind, and of course I didn't pass it. And they transferred me from, first they left me there, and the only people left were all of the flunkies from the entrance test.
Now, is this still in Hawaii, or are you back?
No, this was in Virginia.
Oh, okay. Oh, you got to Virginia, okay.
Right outside of Williamsburg.
Okay.
And boy, if they weren't I tell you, I've never seen such a useless bunch of people. I sure could understand why they didn't get into the academy. They were spoiled, rotten, half of them, and insolent. And the officer in charge of this school, it's a pretty responsible job when they're sorting out candidates for the Naval Academy. He'd been a school superintendent in Texas. He wasn't any more of a Navy man than these kids that were left behind. And they put me in charge of this mob.
Oh, jeez.
And that was a nightmare. That's the worst job I ever had the whole time I was in the Marines. And of course, there was nothing for them to do. Some of them had come from the Army and Europe even. They were pretty good people. They just failed. But anyway, I finally was transferred from there over to a guard detachment in a prison that the Marines were running in another area on that base. It was Camp Perry. Originally it was built to train Seabees, but it was so close to the end of the war they'd shut it down and were using it for a lot of stuff like I was just talking about. And I worked in that Navy prison as minimum security, and I couldn't tell any difference between the kids in there and the ones that I'd been in charge of at the school. It was about the sloppiest run place I ever saw. But anyway, I signed up for classes at William and Mary College in downtown Williamsburg, and I enjoyed that. And I went to classes there, and my job at the prison was to run the armory and the visiting room. And one of the funniest things that happened the whole war to me was there when one day a lot of times we had men that sat in the visiting room all the time, but this one time for some reason I was doing it, and I sat, like if this was the door to the visiting room, my desk was right here, and these long tables with separations top and bottom were here, 2 or 3 of them, and went back maybe 30, 40 feet. And there was a young kid there, and he was sitting at the table, right the first chair. And this older woman was sitting across from him, and they talked. Pretty soon she got up and went over and opened the door and looked out and closed the door and came and sat down again. And this happened about 6 or 8 times every 4 or 5 minutes. So I thought, well, there's something fishy going on. She's waiting for somebody for something. So I called down to the was the Marine office outside the compound, and got a hold of the first sergeant, and I said, there's something fishy going on up here, and I'd appreciate it if you'd have somebody come in here and stand outside and see what it is. I don't want to leave the room here. Well, about 10 minutes later, I got a call back, and it was the first sergeant. He said, well, I went down there myself to look to see what's going on, and he says, that woman is opening the door so she can spit tobacco juice. So then I stayed there, and all of a sudden they announced that I had so many points that I was going to be discharged the 1st of November.
Huh. So this is November of 45, so the war, both theaters were over.
by
Okay,
that.
okay.
Yeah, I was on the train coming back from leave, and we were in Butte, Montana, when the word came. I was on a train that had the Ice Capades troop on it that was going back to Chicago or somewhere. And you know, they were all real pretty gals and young and just real nice gals. And the train was loaded with sailors. And you can imagine the problems.
Yeah.
And the train was stopped there, and we got the word, and everybody was off the train yelling and carrying on. And somewhere, one of those sailors got a skyrocket. And he fired that thing off that, I don't think it was aimed at anything, he just shot it off, and it rammed into a wooden ore bunker alongside the tracks about a block away. And as we pulled out of Butte, you could hear the fire engines coming. This thing was burning pretty good. Imagine he was real glad the train was moving.
Yeah.
But I was released on about the 1st of November, and I withdrew from William and Mary, and I went home and I worked for the post office department.
So you never did get your appointment to the Naval Academy then?
No, that was long ago. That was dead the day after I got there.
Okay.
And
so you
I
returned
worked
back
for
home?
the post office service, postal service, through Christmas and maybe a little after. And then I went back to the University of Oregon in January.
Now, were at the various places that you had taken classes, were you able to get credit for, like at Williams and Mary and USC? Was any of that transferable?
USC was.
Okay.
But I had to withdraw it at William and Mary because I didn't want to stay there for the whole end of that semester. I'd had enough at that time. And so I went back to the University of Oregon and saw my wife in a local coffee shop. And she had her sorority pin on her collar, so I saw what that was. This was before I went back to school. So when I did go back after the first of the year, I talked to one of our guys from my fraternity who was slinging hash at this sorority house that I knew about. So I tried to describe her to him. And he says, she sounds like all the rest of them. He said, why don't you come over and you can look through the windows in the swinging doors into the dining room. So I did, and he says, oh, that's Sis Scott. So I called up the one woman left in that house who had been there when I left, to go to the coat car. And I said, I want to meet that lady. And she said, well, sure. So we arranged it some way or other, and I started taking her out. And she was going out with other guys that I told her they were the biggest cults in the world. And I talked to this girl, Charlotte Gething was her name, a real neat lady, the one that got me the date or introduced me. And a long time, a year or more later, she said, I never could understand why you didn't ask me to go out. And I said, well, I probably would have, but I saw this other one down there and I was kind of interested. Well, anyway, I went back to school. Graduated, went to law school and graduated. In the meantime, I got a commission in the Marines. And I worked at a lot of different summer jobs during that time, from the Forest Service. And we had we had one child at that point, and
So you had married,
oh yeah, we got married.
okay, yeah, you
and
dated.
then had the child, and we had, that was our first child, Sally, and she was, well, anyway, I left to go to Korea. Well, after they recalled me, they were kind enough to let me finish law school one semester, and I took a special bar examination and left, graduated the whole works in 1 week, and my wife was pregnant with our second child. And so I went to Quantico and went through the school there. And my wife came and brought our daughter. And we lived in a place there in Fredericksburg, which was just a little tiny place. Everybody in town called them Smith's Incubators. and then we came back and went down to after I got through at Quantico, I went down to Camp Pendleton, and Sis and the daughter came down there, and then they went home, and I went to Korea in charge of one of the bus loads of enlisted personnel. They hauled us down to San Diego to put us aboard ship. That was another nightmare. We went through downtown Oceanside, which is where Camp Pendleton is. If it weren't for Camp Pendleton, there would be no Oceanside.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what was there. And all the merchants were out sweeping off their sidewalks and getting ready for the day's work. And the guys on that bus threw those windows open and stuck out their heads, and they were calling those people every foul name you ever heard in your life. And I was running up and down the aisles telling them to get their head back in and shut the windows. And then we went past the Del Mar Hotel down by Del Mar Racetrack, and the front yard had a lot of fine canvas summer type furniture. These older women who obviously lived at Del Mar Hotel were out there for the morning sun, and they were giving them the same treatment. And we got down to the ship, and we got aboard, and we left the same day. And the band from the recruit depot was down on the dock playing music. I've got a picture here of that place. We returned to the same place when I came back. And there was a dock, and then this 2-story warehouse, and the second story had a balcony on it. So if you were on the ship, well, you were somewhere near the same level as the balcony. And there were hundreds of mothers, sweethearts, daughters, wives, kids, parents, anything you can think of down there to say goodbye. And right in the middle of this staff car with 3 stars on it came screaming down onto the pier and stopped right by the gangway. And who should get out but Chesty Poor? And he walked down to the dock, so it was a little ways, and he looked up at the side of the ship, and all these guys, every one of them knew who he was. And he said, "You people keep 2 things in mind over there. Stay to the high ground and don't trust the blanking army." So anyway, we left. The band was playing.
Was it tougher for you to leave this time? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
2 times you left, one as a single guy, and now you're leaving behind a wife and
Oh, yeah, that was
and a
a
family.
lot.
Yeah.
Because, the baby was going to be born.
Right. Right.
And we didn't have any arrangements, had no money, no nothing. And poor little sis had to go back. She went up, her parents in the meantime, her father was regular army, and they'd gone to Japan. He was on the MacArthur staff over there. And so they were gone. I saw them later while I was over there, but she went back and stayed in Coos Bay with my folks for a while, and then I never understood how, but they got an apartment in town, and she had that when I got back. But anyway, she had the second child, and well, I got into some pretty hairy stuff in Korea too. I've got some pictures here that are pretty bad. And
So you weren't used with your legal capacity. That was,
at the end.
oh, at the end. But at this point, going to Korea, you were going back as a fighting Marine. You weren't.
Well, I went to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. I was A Company. I had the 1st Platoon. And that was the hottest spot on the whole division front. It was the highest point, and every big wheel from the Navy or the Marine Corps came up to see what was going on where my people were. And
So you were land based this time. You weren't on ship.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was on the regular amphibious forces, and we dug holes in the ground. Well, there were still corpses all around, but we'd driven these people off. And they kept coming at my segment of the line, which couldn't have been more than 50 yards. And I had 36 guys to do that with. Well, plus I had machine gunners too, they were attached. But we'd get into those. They'd come up there at night. It was a reconnaissance outfit for North Koreans. They weren't Chinese. And the North Koreans were a lot bloodier and much more ambitious in their fighting. They came up there and they were trying to get through the lines. And we'd shoot them up every time. And we gradually added wire. And and my best buddy, I've got a picture of him here. He was a lawyer too. And he was in the same boat I was, and he was in charge of the mortars in this company. So every time I needed help, I got the mortars on there. Why, I'd use the phone and get him and start getting what I wanted. And the machine guns were attached, so I controlled when they fired. But we'd just fight those people off and then have to go out the next day and bury them. And I would ask the battalion commander if we couldn't make some arrangements to have those people come and pick up their own corpses and take them home. He said, no, we don't want to do that. And we had a couple of Koreans attached to us that were laborers, essentially. They dug a lot of our holes for us, and so they had to bury the dead, and they just hated that. They didn't want to be anywhere near a dead body. I had to practically drive them to it. Well, our guys ended up doing most of it, but I took patrols out there and wandered around looking for trouble. And I remember one night there was a big bunch of these Koreans came up there. You couldn't tell how many. It was dark. We had our field of fire cleared about 50 yards, and they'd stay on the edge of that in the brush timber. And then they'd try to creep up through the wire and all. And we'd blow them away. But they were really pushing us. Right at the 60 millimeter mortars, that's ours, that I could control. And I had the 81 millimeters, which were controlled by battalion. And I had the artillery keeping us lit up so we could halfway see something. Boy, the old noise was really getting to be something. Grenades, the whole bit going off. And I called back, got on the phone and called my friend Fred back at the mortars, and I said, Fred, can you give us any more fire? He said, what do you mean? He says, we've shot everything except the swabs. But anyway, we held them off and cleaned up the mess the next day. And then the commandant came up one time. There was a huge mountain across from us, which meant they were looking down on us all the time. It was across the Soyang River. And he looked up there at that thing, the commandant. And he thought, he looked around, looked in the valley, and he said, you know, we need that hill over there. And everybody just sort of froze up. Geez, I mean, the top of it was 4 miles away. But anyway, I heard later that he went back to the headquarters battalion of the division, and he went down to look at the prisoners that were back there. The reconnaissance company of the division ran there. There was a kind of a collection spot until they could get enough of them to ship them to the south end to the prisoner of war camps. And they knew a couple of weeks ahead of time that the commandant was going to be there. So they had taught the Marines hymn to all these prisoners who didn't have the faintest idea what they were singing. And the commandant showed up, and they had these clowns sing the Marines hymn and throw their hats in the air, and the commandant just broke up. But anyway, after a while, I was elevated to the job of commanding officer of the heavy weapons company of the battalion, and I stayed with that until I was transferred to the legal section of the division. And at that point, why, I was just trying courts martial. Another funny thing happened. We didn't have to do this, but we did it for the battalions in the division. Our special courts martial could be tried by officers. They had a little format of kind of like a playbook where they could follow it and decide it, and it was considered to be valid. And but we were doing that, and we'd do one case in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one at night. Sometimes we were out there, so we'd just stay all night in the battalion. They'd find a halfway decent place for us to sleep, and they'd feed us. But they brought this file to me and said this guy is the next man that's going to be tried. And he was a little Latino kid, looked like a nice guy, and he's charged with sleeping on watch, which is a serious charge. And I looked in the file, and I can't remember his name, but say it was Smith, and it was a very simple fact situation, and the witnesses were all there. The personnel officer of the battalion had seen to it that they were there. I talked to him on the phone. So we started through this little routine, this little play, and the name, the PFC Smith this and PFC Smith that, and Smith, first 10 or 15 minutes. And this kid leaned over to me and he said, "Who is this guy Smith?" It turns out the personnel man at the battalion had given me the wrong file.
Oh, boy.
And so I said, "Wait, you ought to stop." So we stopped and got up the other file and started all over again. And I had some serious doubts as to whether or not they could lawfully do that, but I never did hear whether he appealed it. But during that time, we moved from the Iron Triangle, where I was with the company, and over to the western part of the Korea. We were right on the 38th parallel. We were on the edge of what they called the Iron Triangle before we moved. And one day I was out at the tank battalion looking for a witness, and the tank commander stuck his head up and said, "Are you Lieutenant Bedingfield?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They want you back at headquarters on the double." So I took off, went back there, and I walked in, and I forget who had told me, but anyway, one of the officers there said, "Representative so-and-so is down in Seoul, and he wants you to come down and stay overnight and have dinner with him." And I'd never heard of the man. I didn't know who it was. So, I stunk like rice patties, and I was filthy dirty, carrying all this ammunition and gun and junk with me. And they took me down in a Jeep down to this airstrip and put me in an L-19 and flew me down there. Landed in the middle of a racetrack in the middle of Seoul. There was a staff car waiting, and I got in, and this starched driver drove me up to the top of a little hill in Seoul where there was a very nice, very small hotel, which was the headquarters for the 8th Army in Korea. And this great big robust guy came up to me, introduced himself. Well, it turned out he was a member of the House of Representatives, national. And he knew my mother-in-law, Sis's mother, and he had stopped to see them in Japan. And they told him that I was over there, so he called up the general and said, "It'd be nice if I could have this young man come down and have dinner." Well, he might as well have said, "I order it to,"
Yeah, yeah.
So it was accomplished, and I went down there and I took off these stinking clothes, and they gave me a Japanese kimono to wear, and they brought me a drink or two, and it was very nice. And about an hour and a half later, all of my clothes were back, cleaned, ironed, and stacked on my bed. And so I got dressed, and we went in and had dinner, and every big wheel on the staff of the 8th Army was at the table.
Wow.
And there was a couple of guys there from the Air Force somewhere in Korea. They were there in their blue uniforms with all their ties and all this junk on, you know, and I looked like a hobo compared to them. But anyway, next morning I got up, went back to the racetrack, got back in the plane, flew back up and went up and got my junk out of the whatever I needed and went back up to the tank battalion.
Huh.
And I got mixed up in a couple of real long courts-martial involving drugs, marijuana, which was a horrible thing in those days. And, you know, the officers they were just dead set on it.
Really?
They did not want that stuff around at all.
Oh, okay.
And you could just, these tank drivers could reach out and pick it up when they were driving over these hills. So finally, I was in the middle of this court-martial, and I got the word that I was going home. And it would probably be about 2 days. That's all the notice I had, and this court-martial was going to last longer than that. No, it was about 6 days later, I guess. But anyway, I was not going to leave that kid there and leave him. I wasn't even sure they'd let me, but I would not leave him in a situation where he'd have to have another lawyer come in to take up. You just can't do that. So I told him, and I told the Navy officer in charge of the legal section, I said, I'm not going to leave that kid here, and I want to be left behind if it works out that way that I have to do that. Well, all of a sudden, we started getting orders to speed up this thing, speed up this trial, and get it over with. Well, the word had come down from on high that the general wanted me out of there because I'd gotten a lot of guys off of marijuana charges. And so I finished it up, and the guy got off, and I was gone. They hauled us down to Incheon. We got back aboard the MSTS ship, General Weigel, and we had 4 courses choice on every meal all the way across the Pacific.
Wow.
And I landed in San Francisco again under the Golden Gate Bridge, and my wife was there to meet me, and we took about 3 days. I had to get physical before I was discharged. All this happened over on Treasure Island, which was familiar to me, and we went out to eat.
You met your? Did you meet your? Did they have the kids there? Did you meet your daughter or son?
No, they were too little.
Oh, okay.
To take the trip.
So you still hadn't met the new one yet?
No,
then?
I
Yeah.
hadn't. And then we drove home, and we pulled up in front of the house, and I'll never forget, my mother was in the door. She saw us. I'm sure she was watching out the window for the last 4 hours. But she looked out and she saw the car parked, and she opened the door, and she kind of, I'm sure, pushed the little girl, 3-year-old, out the door, Sally, and Sally went down the steps about halfway, and then she stopped and she saw me coming toward her, and she did this.
Uh-oh.
She didn't quite remember.
Right.
And the next morning, she came running in the room and jumped on top of me right on the bed, and then she remembered. And she felt
wow.
right about it. And the little guy, he was sitting in a bouncy chair in the living room when I went in, and I went over and picked him up, and he looked at me like, who are you? But anyway, everything went fine after that.
Yeah.
It was quite an experience. Wow. I've left out a lot of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. How was? I'm just going to pepper you with some questions here. As far as, I mean, you went through the 2 different wars. How were they obviously there were very different wars and very different thinking among the population. How did you see the two wars? How did you feel about the two wars? Was there a difference in feeling with you?
Well, I never felt that the American public really understood what the Korean War was about. It was the first hot part of the Cold War.
Right, right.
And I firmly believe that it was necessary to stop those people, and I still do today. I think Japan would be communist today, or would have been for a while. Those people were just unbelievable, and we just massacred them until the Chinese came in. They had just dropped everything and ran, and the Chinese came in because they didn't want us on the border.
Right. Yeah.
And but the Korean War was a strange operation. The United States was supposed to be militarily in charge because frankly everybody was an American that was fighting it. But some of those outfits that were sent in there from other nations were really interesting people. The Turks were, the Chinks were just scared to death of them. You couldn't operate the bolt on their rifle, but their bayonet was just like a surgical instrument. And they'd glint in the sun, you know. And the Chinese would just don't pick up and run when they saw them coming, which is what the Marine Corps always tried to do. But the French were pretty good. The Ethiopians weren't worth anything. And I could go down the list. It varied greatly. The thing that really bothered me was there was no censorship of anything. You could take pictures of anybody or anything. You could write home and tell them everything that happened or what the higher-ups were thinking about doing.
Which is drastically different from World War II.
Yeah. And the British were just horrified. And I don't blame them. So was I, so was everybody in the Marine Corps. It was just incredible. To this day, I cannot understand it. But the Korean War was a half-baked attitude because we weren't ready for it. The LSTs that were used to land at Incheon stunk of fish because they had been sold to the Japanese fishing industry and taken back at the last minute in order to stage that invasion. Now you talk about a Mickey Mouse operation, that was it. The Marine Corps 1st Division consisted of 2 regiments when they were sent over there. The Army sent 2 totally unprepared divisions because they were occupation troops in Japan. They knew all about the philosophical aspects of it, but they had not had very much training in how to fight. And a lot of them were the youngest kind of kids you can have in the military. They wanted to go to college. That's why they were there. And later on, of course, it was entirely different. Ridgway took over, and his wife was a real good friend of my wife's mother. But anyway, it could have been done a lot better. We were using reworked ammunition. A lot of it went off outside the muzzle and killed people. That happened in the States in training. It was reworked. That meant that they had taken a pallet of it and unscrewed all the fuses on it and looked at them and then put them back in willy-nilly.
How did that play on you psychologically? I mean, World War II, there was a big push, everybody was behind you, and now Korean War, it seems like it's just kind of a half-baked, like you said, a half-baked operation.
Well, it wasn't. It's a hard thing to describe. We knew that the people at home were not particularly interested. We were fighting vicious people. We did a good job. At least the people I was with did. Very good job. The 1st Marine Division consisted of over 50% reservists when it finally got to full strength, which was fine. You couldn't tell one from the other. I know one time after we fought off one of these big raiding parties that was trying to break through the line. By that time, my friend Fred had moved up to the battalion. He was a personnel officer up there. He said he heard a couple of the regular officers talking about what had happened that night down there when my people and I fought off another one of these raids. And one of these regular officers, probably a major or lieutenant colonel, said to another one, he says, I can't believe it, that guy's a reservist. Well, that made me feel pretty good,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
I seriously considered going regular. And they asked me to come down to Regiment to talk to them about it, and I did. Yeah, but I told them that I had spent 7 years trying to get to be a lawyer, and I had never practiced a day. And my wife, that was a big point. I couldn't talk to my wife about it. And I had a son I'd never seen.
Right.
So I told them, well, you know, I'll go home, and if they want me as bad as you think, well, I'll write them a letter, and then they'll probably do it. So I never wrote the letter. But a lot of times in practicing law, I wished I'd stayed in the Marine Corps.
Comparing the two conflicts, you know, talking about not being able to talk to your wife, how was communications during World War II back and forth, as well as compare what it was like communicating back and forth in the Korean War?
The Korean War, I understand in the rear areas that you could use the Army telephone service to get to a civilian line in the States.
Oh, I'll be darned, huh?
I know one night there was a deader and a doornail on the lines, and so I just picked up the field phone, and I was going to call Sis's parents over in Yokohama. I guess it was. I can't remember which of the cities, but anyway, they kept patching me and patching me and patching me and patching me. I got as far as Seoul, but as far as Pohang, and which was the perimeter, this last little bit. There's a city in there before we finally had enough people to start pushing them back at the beginning. And I got that far, and that was it. I couldn't get, there was no sound. Nobody talked, nobody asked anything. Dead, totally dead, so I gave up. But I think if it had worked right, I'd have been hooked up with Colonel Scott.
Yeah.
I don't know if he'd ever tried to call me, but I sent mail back and forth. I took pictures, had a camera, took a lot of these pictures I have over here. Sent copies home to Sis, and copies to my parents, and copies to Sis's parents. And well, they were the ones that developed it for me, and I said, well, just, you know, get an extra set for yourself. And some of them are pretty gory. My dad said, thanks for not sending any of these until after you left the line. The discipline in many parts of the service in Korea was very sloppy compared to the Second World War. There was not the urgency of the Second World War because the United States had been shelled and, you know,
Right.
plain spies coming in and that
Right.
type of thing. These Koreans, they weren't able to do much except just drive their tanks and run their guys around with rifles, but there was enough of them at the time when South Korea was pitifully equipped by us, and they didn't have much of an army. They never did have, between you and me. They'd bug out the first time there was some pressure on them. One time, they hit the Korean outfit on our regiment's left flank, the 7th Marines, and they just blew out, and all of a sudden here was hanging open on that whole length of line, and they were coming through it. So we had to shift this whole regiment around into an L-shaped formation. And then some of the other reserve outfits that the Army had finally stopped them back here and pushed them back up where they belonged. But there were all kinds of things happened that were just not done well. That invasion at Incheon was a miracle.
Jim, I apologize there. I had to stop there to change tapes. I'm trying to think where we left off. We were talking about the conflict with in Korea. One question I wanted to ask you, your dad, you're talking about those pictures that you said you'd sent home. Your dad said that you were glad you didn't send them until you got off the front line, which leads to a question I'd like to ask. Both in World War II with your folks, and then in the Korean War with Sis and your folks, did they ever talk about what they were thinking, feeling, and because you're over in harm's way, and what they were thinking about at home? Did you guys ever have that kind of discussion, or?
Well, of course, Sis was concerned. I got that impression from her. She sent me special stuff. I remember we had one replacement lieutenant who had been taken off of Saipan in the Second World War and was attached to my company in Korea. And he was a psycho. He should never have been called back. And Sis sent me whiskey and medicine bottles. And one day I found out my medicine bottle was about half empty. This guy had gotten into it and he had an alcohol problem too. And he did some of the most bizarre things. I don't want to talk about them here, but
Yeah.
I just went down to the medical officers and said, get that guy out of here. I don't want him anywhere near my operation. And he was gone the next day. But there were other mental cases. How'd I get off onto this? My parents wrote faithfully, and we had a kind of a Mickey Mouse code that I never used because it was so cumbersome, but a couple of times I did. There came a time finally aboard the ship where they allowed us to tell everything.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
And nothing was censored? huh?
Late in the
Oh,
war.
okay. Yeah.
Or up to a certain date, but it covered most of the war.
How was that as far as getting mail on the ship with you guys all over the Pacific? Was mail service fairly?
It was whenever they didn't have anything else to haul, they brought the mail. And there was a time there, I didn't tell my folks about a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
That's why I didn't send those pictures. I didn't want my mother to see them. But, or Sis, for that matter.
Right.
I mean, I was thinking of everybody. But, I can't even think of what I was going to say now.
How were I should have asked this back when we were talking about your World War II experience. What was life like on the ship for you as far as accommodations and food and entertainment? And then contrast that with conditions when you were out in the field in Korea. If you talk about both of those real quick.
During the Second World War on that ship, when I got out there, a lot of the real nasty surface fighting was over. That was down around the Solomons. And the Navy had perfected a supply system that was a marvelous thing. They centered it at this place called Ulithi that I've mentioned. They had huge concrete barges, enormous things, that were loaded in the States and hauled out there. And they had everything you can imagine. It was refrigerated, a lot of it. It included fuel oil, but it also included everything that fleet needed, ammunition, the whole bit. Of course, a lot of the ammunition was taken off of, that's the way we got ours. We got ours off of ammunition ships that came out there. And we had ice cream on our ship, and we had it, and we gave it to destroyers. We fueled destroyers fairly frequently because we could, all the bigger ships did, because we could carry so much more than they could. The place was clean. The ship, there was a rack to sleep on, pipe with canvas strung in between them. They were 4 deep, so that when everybody was soaking wet up on the deck and came down to try to get some sleep, it would drip, drip,
Oh,
drip,
geez.
drip all night. There's some nights we'd be called out of there 6 times. But, that's the kind of thing that's just part of fighting the war. The food was, considering everything, was good. Of course, we had people who complained constantly, but it was far better than it was in Korea. A lot of it was fresh when we came in. They had refrigerator ships out there that had fresh fruit and meat and stuff that nobody on the beach ever got, on the lines. It was all sea ration. Although they did, if you were in the rear area, like in Battalion Reserve, why they had a tent camp set up and a kitchen with tarps over it, and they do a little better there. Like at Thanksgiving, they had turkeys. A big dump truck came up and dumped a load of them just like coal right out on the sand, frozen solid, and all that kind of stuff. It was, some of it now is very funny. Aboard ship at one point, I know we had to leave the harbor at Ulithi before we were able to take on food supplies. And we were out for quite a while, and it got down to the point where we were being fed boiled elbow macaroni and what was the other? Like maybe canned fish or something like that. That was all they had. The flour was all full of weevils and couldn't use it, so they'd thrown that overboard. But we would have gotten all new stuff if we'd have been able to stay there, but we had to get out and go do something. We know it was bad enough that they had a patrol bomber, they called it Pioneer. It was a sea-going 4-engine airplane, big one. They brought a lot of vitamin pills out to us. We had doctors, dentists available right on the ship. We had a doctor with us. The battalion aid station was right behind my company on the beach in Korea. The food was strictly sea rations. And
Now we're talking Korea now?
Korea.
Okay. Uh-huh.
It was tin cans, and supposedly the entree, there was about 6 or 7 of them. Spaghetti and meatballs, beans and pork, chicken, stewed chicken, which was highly prized and not very much of it. But the cheap stuff was very plentiful. Baked beans and that. And we had a regular exchange ratio. So many cans of one for another and all that. And there's a lot of times we'd have those little cans of corned beef hash laying around there. Everybody was sick of them. We'd throw them at the gooks at night. And, but the Navy did very well. I know they had refrigeration facilities on Saipan. I heard there were units that could be picked up by a loader, and they were separate, had separate gasoline engine refrigerators. I heard there were just hundreds and acres of them.
Wow.
Now, I don't know who got that stuff, because we got all of our food off of ships, refrigerated ships, supply ships.
Now, as you guys traveled throughout the Pacific, were you able to go on shore at various locations, or were you pretty much on ship the whole?
The whole time I was on there, it got off once.
Is that right?
That was on a sandbar that was about as big as a football field, and we were supposed to have a picnic. And they had some beer on the ship, which I think was against regulations, but anyway, they let half the Marines go one day and half the next. And we just took us on a barge across over to this little dumpy place, maybe that far above sea level. And we each had 1 or 2 cans of Iron City beer. And looked on it, was made in Philadelphia. How it ever got out there, I never could figure out. It was the greenest stuff I ever drank. And we were sitting out, it was right on the equator in the Caroline Islands. And by the end of the time that we were through there, they came back to get us, and those guys had been drinking that beer out in the sun, and they were just pie-eyed. Hadn't had anything to drink, for all that time. And they were yelling and just a big horseplay thing. And we got back on the barge, and they were wrestling and tearing each other's dungarees in the process and all that kind of stuff. And they got us back to the ship, and they were afraid to let us climb the ladders up off of the barge. So this big crane on the back of the ship was used to take aircraft and put them back on the ramps, come on. Anyway, the things
Right.
they launched.
Yep.
And they put this cargo net down in the bottom of the barge and told all of us to climb on there.
Uh-oh.
And so we did, and there were legs and arms sticking out through it. This mass of drunk humanity was lifted up and swung over and put down on the deck. And man, there was one mad Marine captain there when we landed on deck. And the next day, I think one of the officers went with him. Things were a little bit calmer. Yeah, and then when we left Korea, we stopped at the same dock that we stopped at on our way in Japan, because we had to switch ships. No, we didn't either, not on the way home. On the way out, we switched to an amphibious assault craft. But coming home, we got on this military transport, which is a real nice thing. Beautiful dining room. It wasn't the Queen Mary, but compared to what we had known, it was fabulous. We even had a choice on the menu. But we docked in Kobe for 2 nights, and we had about 1,100 Marines going home on this thing. And none of us had been paid for I don't know how long, since we got to Korea. So we didn't have any money. They gave us, we could ask for $20 a month just to buy toothpaste and stuff. And so a paymaster came aboard, and somebody had said, don't you give those people more than this amount of money. I don't know who did it, but probably the draft commander. So they paid off all the troops, and they let half of them go downtown the first night. And I was the officer of the deck that night. And these guys all left, and man, they were looking for a big time. Kobe is built like a half a dish pan. It's been cut in half. It slopes up to these cliffs around the upper edge, and all the homes and stuff, and down below, as closer you got to the docks, by the, it was more industrial. Mm-hmm. And we had a Marine guard at the foot of the brow, as usual, on the dock, and it just, you could hear it. You just hear this racket going up through Kobe from these guys yelling and carrying on. And a lot of those small merchants had stores. Like if this is the front of the store, there was a flap went down at night, and in the daytime they'd lift it up and put sticks under the front of it. These guys were going along there, well, later on. Anyway, they got up there and they got into fist fights and everything you read about over the centuries. And about 20 of them landed in the brig, and I had to go down and get them the next morning. And but anyway, I think they were supposed to be back aboard at 11 o'clock. And the pier was all lit up so you could see pretty well. But they'd come staggering down there, yelling and singing and carrying on. They'd come down in rickshaws, come aboard. Sometimes they'd be so bad I'd have to call down to the compartment and have some of the guys to come up and take hold of them and out of sight. And pretty soon, just before closing hours, here came this guy who was just plastered, pulling the rickshaw, and he had the whole thing full of boxes of Japanese china dishes, which were very nice. They were of a brand that was well known in the States at that time. And you could buy sets of them. We were allowed to go to the PX there. And I don't know how much of that stuff those guys on that ship bought, but the passageways were lined with it on the way back from Japan. But anyway, this guy came down there staggering along, pulling this thing, and behind him about 50 feet was the Japanese. And the guy set the rickshaw down right at the foot of the brow. And the brow guard called up and he said, "These boxes are wrapped in rice straw." And I said, "Well, you know the rules, cut it off." So they cut it off. It had bugs in it and they didn't want it on the ship. And this guy couldn't carry the stuff, so I called a couple of our fellows up and they helped him carry it down. I don't know where they put it. And no more had they gotten the last box off of it than the guy with the rickshaw started to come aboard. And he had told the brow guard that he had bought the rickshaw from the Jap. And the brow guard said, well, what are you going to do with your rickshaw? And this guy says, I don't care about the damn thing, I just want to go aboard. And the brow guard yelled up to me and he said, this guy owns this rickshaw and he wants to leave it here, is that all right? I said, give it back to the guy he bought it from. Oh. The guy, we had the little chap, he heard it. I guess he understood it anyway. He came down there and this Marine was herded up and put below, and the guy picked up the rickshaw and he had the money and the rickshaw. So that was just one fun. And another thing that was really unusual was the morning we left Kobe to come home, they had, in the morning hours, they had, after breakfast, they had fed us a real good breakfast. It was good food. Why, we left, and they immediately had everybody line up and gave us pills to kill stomach worms. And we got out, and the sea was fairly rough, and a lot of these guys started getting sick, and they were throwing up their breakfast, and it had dead stomach worms in it.
Oh.
That doesn't happen on the Queen Elizabeth.
No. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, you'd mentioned being near the equator. In World War II, where you were assigned to that ship, whenever you guys crossed the equator, were you part of the polywog ceremonies? Or?
We never had time to do all that.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And nobody cared.
Oh, okay.
It's just like when Roosevelt died, it didn't mean anything to us. When Truman died, when Truman became president, the slogan in the whole detachment was Golden Gate in 48. That was widespread in the Pacific. They just figured, oh, geez, another 3 years of this because Roosevelt was dead.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, Truman didn't have much effect on it except with making the decision on the bomb.
Bombs, right?
I think anybody else would have made the same decision.
Yeah, yeah. How do you, in your mind, compare being a veteran of both the Korean War and World War II? Nowadays, I mean, by and large, the Korean War and the veterans have been forgotten, whereas, how do you feel about it? I mean, and World War II veteran is well thought of. Is there any feeling or thoughts on the two comparisons and how the two types of veterans have been treated?
Well, one thing that really irritates me is I constantly hear these veterans following the Korean War, any one of the wars after that, complaining because they never got to take part in a parade. Well, I never knew a Second World War or a Korean War vet that took part in a parade. I don't know where they all happened. But you know, if these guys later on want to have a parade, that's fine with me. But the Second World War was a much more serious time. The people realized that this was no backyard scrap. Yeah. And they kind of treated the Korean War that way.
Oh, okay.
Like a banana war. But it wasn't. It was there were 35,000 dead in that thing. And 100,000 wounded, and we did that in 3 years. Yeah, yeah. There was 52,000 dead in Vietnam, and that took 10, 11 years. Yeah. It was a hard-fought battle. And a lot of real bad mistakes were made at the top in the early part. Right. Sending those troops up there the way they were organized to the Yangtze River was just inexcusable. Yeah.
Well, we'll start to, I guess, wind down this interview. So after the war, you came back, got reacclimated, and went on to a law career then?
Oh, yeah. I was a lawyer. Then I served in the state legislature for 2 terms. And after that, I was the fellow that I knew when I was in the legislature. About 12 years later, he was governor, and he appointed me to be the director of the executive department of the state. So I went up there and did that job, 79 and 80. I really enjoyed it too. But there were some things that had to be taken care of back in the law firm, and so as soon as I had done one of the things he wanted done, I And Sis and the kids all moved up there. That was a good experience for them when I was in the legislature.
Mhm.
You know, it's good for kids. They don't like it, but it's good for them to move into groups of strangers. Our kids did real well at it.
And you had just the two children?
Mhm.
Just the two, son and daughter? Or did you have any-
And we had two more.
two more, four children?
The two youngest ones are both here in town.
And how many
And-
grandchildren and great-grandchildren?
We have 10 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. And I think the wave has just started on the great-grandchildren.
Yeah.
After it got to 1983, and Sis and I had gone to Hawaii on vacation several times, and he had most of the time gone to the Big Island, and we had decided we were going to retire there.
Mm.
So I came home one day in 1983, and I said, I've had it with this kind of work, I want to go. I was exhausted. And there were a lot of things that I didn't like about what was going on, so we sold out. Well, I was in 82. We finally left in 83 and moved to Hawaii. And over there we operated a big Christmas tree farm. We cut it out of the jungle. And
Oh, wow.
it was up high, 3,000 feet. It didn't look anything like the travel brochures with the palms. And we had a Christmas store there that was open in November and December. Sis did most of that. It was quite well known in the islands. But it got to we had 20,000 trees.
Wow.
And we just wore out doing that too. And then we sold out that and moved down on the beach for 4 years, and that was the real Hawaii. And we enjoyed that a lot, made a lot of good friends over there. You miss them now. But all these things were going on with our children. We were over there for 17 years. All these things were going on with our family, and we were missing out on a lot of it, so we moved back. And we came here in 2003. We moved to Hawaii in 1987. I'm not sure I gave, well, the date doesn't
Yeah.
make that much
Yeah.
difference. But we moved here 6 years ago, almost 6 years. And we've done well. We belong to a lot of things here. We're very happy. Real nice people. Real nice. We like Greeley a lot.
Very good. Well, we'll start to wind down this interview. One thing I always like to ask towards the end is, was there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? Any stories you remember now that you'd like to add? Sis, please jump in at this point, and if there's anything we left out that you wanted to talk, that you'd like him to talk about, and we'll, so we make sure we cap
Does
everything
she
as best
get
we
to
can.
come and sit in the chair?
If she would, one, she could. Is there anything you can think of that you'd like?
Just that now he's just as busy with hospice. Very, very involved in the board and 2 committees. So he's always been active in giving and doing things. As when you're somewhere, he's volunteered.
Oh, I was
his
a
service.
deputy fire chief too for a while. The auxiliary department.
Yeah.
I wore a white helmet, but nobody paid any attention to me.
Well, one of the last questions I always like to ask is, how do you think both wars that you're in, how did that play a role in your life, affect your life, change your life at all, or was it just simply a chapter of your life that you went through?
Oh no, it had a huge impact on me. I went in the Marine Corps when I was 18 years old, as soon as I was 18. And of course, that's, in my estimation, that's the most impressionable age that any human is. And it sure made an impression on me. I learned a lot of habits and values that I either follow to this day and some that I avoid to this day, because there's all kinds of people in the Marine Corps, just like any other branch of the service. But I think that the Marines they were the greatest. As I say, I almost stayed in.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then of course I went back to Korea again, but with all of the killing that went on, idea how many people I killed or ordered killed.
Right, right.
And I think about that at night. And it has had a subduing impact on me, I'm sure. I never was a very giggly type. And so probably a lot of times I'm looking at situations a lot different than other people are.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes I get real disgusted with what I consider to be just spinelessness on the part of the people.
When he came back from Korea, and several years later, 2 or 3 years later, he became president of the Rotary Club there in Coos Bay, Oregon. And but before, he was told then of a statement that he'd made when he first came back from Korea and joined the club. And this older man told him, he said, you know, I thought you were just being bitter about having to fight the war. And the things that you said about what's going on, what people are the way they're behaving now, and how life has changed. And he says, now I see what you told us then was true now. I see what you were trying to tell us.
Could you see a difference in him from when he left from Korea and came back? Was there?
No, he was still the serious person. He believed in what he was doing, and he believed in the cause. He believes in his country.
Well, with that, Jim, lastly, is there any sort of statement you would like to make to cap off this interview to family and friends that will watch this? Kind of an open mic, any sort of statement you'd like to make to close it off, or not?
Well, I don't have any profound statement to make.
Okay.
A lot of what I would say would be totally misinterpreted by the people who would hear it.
Okay.
Quite frankly, I am concerned about the ability of the population in this country today to tolerate difficulty. Very concerned. In the last 20 years, I have seen such a change. And I feel frustrated because I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
I think probably deep in my heart I'd like to march them all into the boot camp. But you know, there's a lot of veterans that would be irate at my saying that because they don't feel that way.
Yeah.
I don't think. But I know that the guys that I was with over there who died, they never had any idea that this country was going to be like it is today.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for sitting down to tell your story today, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, I was glad to do it. I'll go again, too. This is a picture of Fred Stanton. He's the fellow that I talked about who told me in the middle of the firefight that he was firing everything but the swabs. One of my best friends.
And this was Korean, and you said, and
This
that's
is taken
you said
in-
this is a very special
This is
picture for you.
taken it's one of my favorites because he and I went through quite a bit together. He now lives in Florida. That's me in Korea just before, right after I arrived there, and I was in the division reserve area. We left after that picture was taken about 2 days later to go up to the lines. That is the 1st Battalion review for the purpose of giving awards. It shows my company with me in front of it, parading in front of the personnel officer of the battalion, which is Fred, the guy we just looked at first. These two fellows are my initial company commander and the company executive officer. This is a picture of the wire that we put in front of our positions in one part of the front line. This is one of the 60 millimeter mortars that we used. It's extremely common in infantry organizations.
Now, Sis, as we were talking here, reminded you of the all the bells and whistles and stuff that they would, as they attacked. Do you want to briefly?
Yeah, we didn't hear much of that, but there was a lot of it went on. It was in more an open country where they could attack en masse. Those two fellows are South Koreans employed as laborers and were attached to our company. The one on the left we called Bugs Bunny. This is a picture of all the company officers of A Company except the executive officer in the reserve area at Christmas time in 1952. This shows a Korean village along the railroad tracks. I took it from the boxcar as we were being hauled to Incheon to come home.
Now, through the years, did you ever have a chance to travel back to Korea or any South Pacific? Okay.
Never have. This picture shows, it was taken from the General Weigel, the MSTS ship. It shows the pier in Oakland at Navy Pier when we came home from Korea. That is a bridge that was in existence before the Freedom Bridge was built, from over which all of the prisoners of war were repatriated. The new bridge is shown at the right, and that's the one that was actually used. That's a picture of the area that we defended on the edge of the Iron Triangle when we moved on to it. I think that was the first day we were there before we dug in or made any changes.
Well, those are pretty primitive conditions. Were you able to get R&R and get off the line to just sat there? Oh, boy.
Okay, I was curious.
That's me sitting on some sandbags up on the front lines. This shows me holding a pair of wire cutters that had been captured by the North Koreans and which we got back from them in one of our night fights. This is me on the front lines having a can of beer, which was very unusual. This is a picture of 3 machine gunners. The 2 on the left were killed about 2 days after this picture was taken. The picture here is of the area that we were in.
Were you, I mean, I understand Korea was cold. Were you properly clothed and, I mean,
Well,
accommodations?
as much as you could be.
Yeah.
It was so cold that they couldn't prevent suffering. It was just miserable. This shows our company interpreter, a South Korean, with a North Korean who has just captured and is very happy about it.